waters in 332 BC. Imagine this. Sand. Simple, ordinary sand, heated to over 1,000 degrees, poured through murder holes onto Macedonian soldiers below. The granules infiltrated every gap in their bronze armor, searing flesh, cooking men from the inside out. Warriors who had conquered half the known world begged for death, as their own protection became an inescapable oven. But here's what makes this siege absolutely mind-blowing. Alexander didn't have a navy. Tyre sat half a mile offshore, surrounded by walls 700 feet high. That's 70 stories in modern terms. The Tyrians laughed from their boats, mocking the young conqueror. They controlled the seas. They had food, water, and the most advanced defenses in the ancient world. By every law of warfare, they were untouchable. Yet within 7 months, 3 mysteries would unfold that changed history forever. First, how did ancient engineers build a half-mile bridge across open ocean while under constant attack? Second, what made burning sand more terrifying than any weapon ever deployed in ancient warfare? And third, why did Alexander, a man who often showed mercy to fallen enemies, crucify 2,000 people along the beach? The defenders had a secret weapon that turned armor into torture chambers. The Tyrian commander, who mocked Alexander from his ship, would pay a price beyond imagination. And before this siege ended, the Mediterranean itself would be forever changed. What you're about to discover isn't just a battle. It's the moment human ambition conquered nature itself. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of history's most decisive battles, where engineering genius meets human brutality, hit that like button and subscribe for more epic war content. Ring the notification bell, because what I'm about to reveal will change how you see ancient warfare. Now, let me take you back to 332 BC. Let me set the stage for the siege that defied nature itself. Alexander of Macedon, just 23 years old, had already shattered the Persian Empire's western defenses. Fresh from victories at Granicus and Issus, his seemingly unstoppable army marched down the Mediterranean coast. Every city had fallen or surrendered. Every city except one, Tyre, the jewel of Phoenicia. For 2,500 years, this island fortress had grown fat on maritime trade, its purple dye worth more than gold, its merchants controlling trade routes from Egypt to Anatolia. The city sat like a defiant fist of rock and stone, half a mile from the Lebanese coast. Those 700-foot walls weren't just tall, they were engineering marvels, built from massive limestone blocks, fitted so perfectly that knives couldn't penetrate the joints. Think about this for a second. Tyre had survived Assyrian sieges, Babylonian assaults, and Persian dominion. Even Nebuchadnezzar, destroyer of Jerusalem, had besieged Tyre for 13 years and failed. The island produced its own food, collected rainwater in vast cisterns, and maintained the Mediterranean's most formidable navy, 80 warships that patrolled the waters like predatory sharks. King Azamilkos ruled from his palace at the island's heart, confident in Tyre's ancient invincibility. When Alexander's envoys arrived in January 332 BC, requesting to sacrifice at the temple of Melkart, whom Greeks called Heracles, Alexander's claimed ancestor, the king made a fatal miscalculation. He offered a compromise. Alexander could sacrifice at the mainland temple in Old Tyre, but not on the sacred island itself. What happened next defied 2,000 years of siege warfare. The refusal struck at Alexander's pride and strategic needs equally. Tyre served as Persia's primary naval base in the Mediterranean. Persian gold flowed through its treasuries to fund resistance across Greece. As long as Tyre stood, Alexander's supply lines remained vulnerable, his conquest incomplete. But how do you besiege an island without a navy? Alexander's fleet consisted of a handful of allied ships, outnumbered 8-1 by Tyrian vessels. The water between mainland and island averaged 20 feet deep, impossible for conventional siege weapons. Every military advisor in Alexander's camp must have thought their king had finally found an impossible target. Alexander the God King, as he'd begun calling himself after the oracle at Siwa, stood on the shore, studying the defiant island. The merchant princes of Tyre had calculated that geography made them invulnerable. They hadn't calculated on facing a man who believed himself descended from gods and destined to conquer the world. "If Tyre won't come to me," Alexander reportedly said, his heterochromatic eyes, one blue, one brown, gleaming with dangerous inspiration, "then I'll bring the land to Tyre." The Macedonian engineers exchanged worried glances. Their king had just proposed the impossible, building a causeway across half a mile of open ocean under enemy naval attack to reach the most fortified city in the known world. It wasn't a plan, it was madness that somehow sounded like genius. Nobody expected what came next, not even Alexander's own generals. The young conqueror ordered the complete demolition of old Tyre on the mainland. Every stone, every timber, every handful of earth would serve his purpose. The ancient city would die to build a bridge of conquest. But how do you besiege an island without a navy? You change the rules of nature itself. Alexander's veterans, 30,000 men who had marched from Macedonia through Anatolia, hardened by victories over forces 3 times their size, now faced their strangest battlefield yet. These were soldiers who had charged Persian cavalry at Granicus, while outnumbered 5 to 1, who had shattered the immortals at Issus. Their engineers had breached the walls of Miletus and Halicarnassus, but building a bridge across the sea while under attack, this bordered on divine madness. The Macedonian force comprised elite units. The companion cavalry, though useless in a naval siege, the deadly Macedonian phalanx, with their 18-foot sarissas, Cretan archers, renowned for their accuracy, and most crucially, the siege engineers, who had perfected the art of wall-breaking under Alexander's father, Philip II. On the island, 40,000 Tyrians prepared for siege. Not just soldiers, but every able-bodied citizen. The city's defenses represented 25 centuries of accumulated wisdom. Those 700-foot walls stood thickest on the eastern side, facing the mainland, 150 feet at the base, tapering as they rose. Bronze shields studded the battlements, designed to deflect catapult stones. Murder holes allowed defenders to rain death on attackers below. But here's where it gets insane. The Tyrians possessed weapons most armies couldn't imagine. Besides conventional arrows and stones, they had prepared massive bronze cauldrons for heating sand, a defense so horrific that ancient historians struggled to describe its effects. They'd stockpiled chains to entangle siege engines, grappling hooks to overturn ladders, and most importantly, they commanded the seas. Alexander's solution stunned his own generals. He ordered the systematic destruction of old Tyre, that ancient mainland settlement, but the true genius lay in what came next. Lebanese cedar, the same legendary wood Solomon used for his temple, would form the skeleton of his impossible bridge. Teams of engineers scoured the coastal forests, selecting trees 40 feet tall with trunks 2 feet thick. Here's what made Alexander different from every conqueror before him. Where others saw obstacles, he saw materials. The demolished stones of old Tyre became fill. The mighty cedars became pilings. Even the earth itself served his purpose. He assigned different units specific roles. The Thracians would drive piles, the Greeks would haul stones, the Macedonians would build the advancing causeway. But wait, it gets more incredible. Alexander didn't just order construction. He worked alongside his men, carrying stones, driving stakes. When Tyrian boats approached to mock the laboring soldiers, the young king stood visible on the growing mole, daring them to attack. This wasn't just leadership, it was calculated psychological warfare. The causeway plan seemed simple in concept, impossible in execution. Starting from the mainland, they would drive cedar pilings deep into the seabed, creating a wooden framework. Stones and earth would fill the gaps, gradually extending the artificial peninsula toward Tyre. The initial width, 200 feet, would accommodate siege towers and provide room for defenders against naval attacks. Then, something happened that turned physics into a weapon. The Tyrians, watching from their walls, initially laughed at the enterprise. Their ships rowed close, warriors jeering at the laboring Macedonians. "Do you think you're Poseidon?" they shouted. "Will you command the sea to become land?" Yet as the first cedar stakes pierced the shallow coastal waters, the mockery contained an edge of concern. No one had attempted anything like this in recorded history. The daily progress, 12 feet of causeway completed, seemed glacial. At this rate, the siege would last months, maybe years. Pattern interrupts every 250 words kept the defenders guessing. Some days, Alexander focused all efforts on one section, driving it forward rapidly. Other days, he spread construction across the entire width, confusing Tyrian observers about his true intentions. The engineers discovered a sandbar extending partway to the island, nature's gift to their impossible task. As February turned to March, the causeway crept seaward like a stone serpent. Tyrian naval patrols increased, but they faced a dilemma. Attacking the workers risked grounding their ships in shallow water. The mole had reached deeper water now, where the real challenges began. 20-foot depths required longer pilings, more fill material, greater engineering precision. The Tyrians prepared their response. In the harbour, shipwrights worked on something special. Vessels designed not for combat, but for destruction. They packed aged transport ships with dry wood, pitch, sulfur, and anything flammable. These fireships would soon demonstrate why Tyre had survived 25 centuries. The first stake driven into the seabed would unleash 7 months of hell. Day by day, the impossible took shape. Macedonian engineers, working in shifts that lasted from dawn to dusk, developed a rhythm of construction that defied belief. First came the pile drivers, massive wooden frames operated by 20 men, slamming 40-foot cedar trunks through water into bedrock below. The sound echoed across the water. Thoom, doom, doom. A heartbeat of conquest that never ceased. Here's what made this engineering feat extraordinary. Each piling had to be precisely placed. Too close together, and they'd split under pressure. Too far apart, and the fill material would wash away. The engineers used weighted ropes to measure depth, calculating the exact length needed for each stake to reach solid ground, while leaving enough above water to support the causeway. What happened next defied 2,000 years of siege warfare. As the mole extended beyond shallow water, Tyrian ships began probing attacks. Small, swift vessels would dart in at dawn, archers loosing arrows at the workers before retreating beyond retaliation range. Alexander responded by positioning his Cretan archers on completed sections, creating a deadly crossfire zone. The construction technique itself bordered on genius. Workers would drive 2 parallel rows of pilings, approximately 30 feet apart. Between these wooden walls, they dumped stones. First massive blocks from old Tyre's demolished walls as foundation, then smaller rubble as fill. Earth and sand packed the gaps, gradually creating solid ground where ocean had ruled for millennia. But the sea fought back. Spring storms in the eastern Mediterranean could generate 15-foot waves. The first major tempest struck in early March, just as the causeway reached deeper water. Macedonian soldiers watched in horror as waves crashed over their work, washing away tons of fill material. Pilings groaned under the assault, some snapping like twigs. Nobody expected what came next, not even Alexander. Rather than retreat, he ordered the mole widened. If nature wanted a fight, he'd build something even storms couldn't destroy. The causeway expanded from 200 feet to nearly 300 at its base, tapering as it extended seaward. This meant triple the materials, triple the labor, but it created a structure that could withstand Mediterranean fury. The underwater engineering details reveal ancient innovation at its peak. Divers, mostly Greek sponge hunters recruited from nearby islands, worked in shifts to clear obstacles from the seabed. They reported eerie discoveries: ancient anchors from ships wrecked on Tyre's defenses, human skulls from forgotten naval battles, and most disturbing, evidence that the Tyrians were placing underwater obstacles. In just 30 seconds, everything changed. A Macedonian work crew, driving piles in 12 feet of water, suddenly screamed warnings. Tyrian divers had attached ropes to the underwater portions of the pilings. When ships pulled these ropes, entire sections of carefully placed cedars toppled like dominoes. Days of work vanished in moments. Alexander's response demonstrated tactical brilliance. He ordered the construction of floating barriers, logs chained together, to protect work areas from both ships and divers. Macedonian soldiers with long spears patrolled these barriers, ready to strike at any Tyrian swimmer who approached. The construction site became an armed camp, advancing across water. By late March, the causeway had reached the halfway point, 1,300 feet from shore. Here, the water depth approached 20 feet, and Tyrian naval attacks intensified, but patterns emerged in their assaults. Morning attacks came from the North Harbour, afternoon raids from the south. Alexander positioned his siege engines accordingly, turning construction equipment into defensive weapons. The wooden stake technique underwent constant refinement. Engineers discovered that driving piles at slight angles, creating an inverted V-shape, provided superior stability against lateral wave pressure. They developed a coating of pine tar mixed with sand that protected the cedar from marine borers. Every challenge sparked innovation. Then physics itself became the enemy. As the causeway extended, it began affecting local currents. Water that normally flowed freely between island and mainland now funneled through the remaining gap with increased force. This accelerated erosion threatened to undermine everything they'd built. The solution? More mass. Alexander ordered every available stone within 10 miles brought to the growing mole. What followed wasn't warfare, it was alchemy of death in preparation. While Macedonians laboured on their bridge, Tyrian